Good to be back with you. Hope you had a good holiday season. We did. Enjoyed some time with the family. Ate way too much. Aren't you glad gluttony isn't a sin? Is that right? But we did enjoy the time with the families. Good to be back. To our lesson then for today. So we're coming back to the Gospel of Luke now after that break in the holidays when we looked at the story of Jesus' birth in the different Gospels. And where we are now this morning is at a turning point in the Gospel of Luke. A critical point in the life of Jesus. So we'll take just a moment and look at how Luke lays out his Gospel. So can you put up that next slide? Yeah, so this is a basic outline of Luke. He starts with a short little prologue, opening statement, and then has a kind of a section on the beginnings, the beginning of the story, birth of John the Baptist, birth of Jesus, the start of Jesus' ministry there as he announces, just before he announces his ministry, but this temptation and so on. It's beginning stuff. Then there's a section on his ministry in Galilee, and we've looked at a couple of stories out of that section. Most of that section focuses on an introduction to who Jesus is as he performs miracles and so on. The last section of the gospel is on the last week in Jesus' life in Jerusalem. Notice that the longest section in Luke is that middle section on the road to Jerusalem. That's unique in Luke, that he spends that much time on that part of Jesus' ministry. In chapter 9, he announces he's going to Jerusalem. We'll see that in a minute. He's going there to die. And he spends most of his gospel on this section. It's interesting looking at the gospels, where a gospel writer chooses to spend most of his time. It tells us something about why he's writing, what he wants his audience to know. For example, Mark spends a third of his gospel on the last week of Jesus' life. You get an idea of what Mark thinks is important. The Gospel of John spends 5 chapters on one evening. Jesus in the upper room on his last night with his disciples. You get the idea. John 13 to 17 is really important to John. A lot of time on that part. Well, Luke wants us to know that the road to Jerusalem is critical. It's the heart of the story for Luke. We're going to see the introduction to that today. And then over the next few weeks, we'll look as Jesus talks to his followers on his way to the cross about what it means to follow him. The two questions that the Gospels are written to answer are who is Jesus and what does it mean to follow him? Can you go to the next slide there? Who is Jesus and what does it mean to follow him? And in the middle section of Luke, in this long road to Jerusalem, most of what Jesus is concerned about is that second question. What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus on the way to the cross? And some of his most famous teachings are in there. We're going to look at a few of those over the course of the next few weeks. Some of his most famous encounters and most famous teaching. We'll look at Mary and Martha. We'll look at his teaching about the greatest commands, the Good Samaritan, the rich man and Lazarus. As Jesus really challenges the values of people and helps them understand what it means to follow him in this new way, this kingdom way of life. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on today. We want to look as he announces this turn, as Luke really focuses in chapter 9 on both of these questions. Who is Jesus? What does it mean to follow him? It goes back and forth between those two. So this section opens with no less than King Herod asking, who is Jesus? He says, I killed John the Baptist, now who's this guy? Where did he come from? That kind of sets off this discussion. Who is Jesus? And the response to that in Luke is the feeding of the 5,000. First answer to the question, who is Jesus, is he feeds people, thousands of people. He's like Moses feeding people in the wilderness with the manna, but he's even greater than Moses. Moses had to pray, wait for God to provide manna. Jesus just says, here, give me some bread, and just starts passing it out. Who is this? Jesus. He's a new Moses, greater than Moses. And notice how he uses his power. He is Lord, but he uses his power not for power, but to help people. We'll return to that. And then he turns to his disciples and says, so who are people saying I am? We know Herod already asked the question. How are people answering this? People have heard the stories about me. Who do they think I am? And people come up with all kinds of answers. One of the interesting ones that Luke highlights is Elijah. Moses and Elijah. Elijah is the great prophet, the prototypical prophet who did miracles. He was the one that people thought about. When they thought about who a prophet was, they thought about Elijah, and they connected Elijah to the coming of the Messiah. Because there's a prophecy back in Malachi that says that Elijah would come before the great day of the Lord. So the people were looking forward to Elijah coming to announce the coming of the Messiah and the fulfillment of God's promises. They're all excited about this, and they're wondering, is John the Baptist Elijah? He got his head cut off. Is Jesus Elijah? And then Peter says, you're the Messiah of God, the Christ of God. The word Messiah in Hebrew, Christ in Greek, mean the same thing. It's the anointed king. This is what they've been waiting for. They've been praying for, longing for a new king like David. And Peter's all excited. He thinks that's who Jesus is. You're the king we've been waiting on. You're the Messiah. Jesus says, don't tell anybody that. What? What do you mean don't tell anybody that? I thought everybody was supposed to know that. Jesus knows they're not ready yet. Because what they mean by that and what Jesus means by that are not the same thing. What Peter's all excited about is going to Jerusalem for the Messiah to be crowned king like David, to kick the Romans out and to establish a glorious kingdom. He wants the Messiah to make Israel great and glorious like it was in David's day. That's what it means that the Messiah is coming. That's who he thinks Jesus is. But then Jesus says, the Son of Man, it's another phrase for the Messiah, must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the rulers of the people, the chief priests, the scribes. Wait. Those are all the people who are supposed to celebrate the Messiah. They're supposed to crown the Messiah king. The high priest is supposed to anoint the Messiah. He's going to be rejected by all the religious leaders and be killed. And on the third day, rise again. And never mind the third day, rise again. They can't get past the be killed part. No bucket to put that in. What kind of Messiah is this? Who is Jesus? He's the Messiah of God. But he's a different kind of Messiah. He's a Messiah who comes not for glory and power, he comes for self-sacrifice. He comes to die. And then Jesus says, this means something for you if you're going to follow me. If the Messiah is going to Jerusalem to die, then what's going to happen with all of the people who've chosen to follow him? Because what Peter thinks is going to happen, what the disciples think is going to happen, is when the Messiah gets crowned king, they all get positions in the cabinet. You know? They all get power and glory and riches. That's what they signed up for. Jesus says, if you want to follow me, you're going to have to take up a cross too. And they all know what that means to take up a cross because they've seen it. The Romans were notorious for doing this. And they know that when you get condemned to die, they take a crossbeam. I know we've all seen the pictures of Jesus carrying the big T, dragging it down the street. But what they actually did was carry just the crossbeam. And they would carry that out to the place where the crucifixion was. And there'd be a post there. And they would strap that crossbeam to that post, nail them to that cross. And they'd seen people do this, carrying a cross. They know what that means. They know what happens to you when you carry a cross. Jesus says, you've got to deny yourself and take up your cross daily and follow me. It's not a one-time thing. It's a way of life to daily live carrying a cross. Whoever would save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. Because what good's it going to do you if you got the whole world? That's what they wanted. They wanted all the riches and the power. He says, what good is all that going to do to you if you lose yourself? And the way to find yourself is on the way of the cross. The way of the cross is a path of self-sacrifice, not self-enrichment. And that is not a path that Jesus' followers were yet prepared to walk. And I wonder, honestly, in America, if we're ready to follow it either. Is that what we sign up for in church? It's a religion of self-denial and self-sacrifice, humble service. The author and minister Shane Claiborne wrote a very stirring book called The Irresistible Revolution. And in it, he describes a summer he spent with Mother Teresa in Calcutta in India, where she had a long and well-known ministry to lepers and the poor and so on. And he said, people often ask me what Mother Teresa was like, and he says, sometimes it's like they wonder if she glowed in the dark or had a halo or something. He said she was short, wrinkled, precious, maybe a little ornery, kind of like a beautiful, wise old granny. He said, but there's one thing I will never forget about her, is her feet. Her feet were deformed. He said, every morning at Mass when she would kneel there, I would find myself staring at her feet. I wondered if she had contracted leprosy or something. He said, I never asked her. I wasn't going to go like, hey, Mother, what's with your feet? He said that one day one of the nuns came and said, have you noticed her feet? He said her feet are deformed because we get donations of just enough shoes for everybody to have a pair. But she doesn't want anyone to have the worst pair of shoes. So before the shoes are distributed, she goes through all the donations and picks out the worst pair of shoes in the lot and takes those for herself. And years of wearing the worst pair of shoes has deformed her feet. Wow. I don't know if I signed up for that. Years of loving her neighbor as herself, years of taking up a cross to serve others, has actually cost her deformed feet. And then Luke turns again to the question of who is Jesus. So he says, about 8 days later, Jesus goes up on a mountain. He takes Peter and James and John, this inner circle of his followers, and he says to them, come with me. And then they watch this thing happen. It's hard, I think, for the writers to even describe. Somehow Jesus' appearance changes. So we call it the Transfiguration, because his very appearance is transformed, transfigured. His clothes become dazzling white. He looks different. Suddenly, two figures are standing with him, Moses and Elijah again. I don't know how they recognized it was Moses and Elijah. It's not like people had Polaroid pictures of them, but somehow it was evident in this moment. It was revealed to them. Here's Jesus with Moses and Elijah. And they're talking. And it's interesting what they're talking about. Luke says they spoke with Jesus about his departure that he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. They talked to Jesus about what's about to happen. I don't know if Jesus needed encouragement. I don't know what the conversation was about. Luke just tells us, though, that after Jesus announces that he's going to Jerusalem to die, Moses and Elijah appear to him and talk about it. And the disciples get to witness. And Peter is amazed by this, but he kind of puts them all on the same plane. He says, let's build 3 shrines up here, one for each of them. And this voice from heaven says, no, this is my son. Who is Jesus? There's another revelation of who Jesus is. He is the Son of God. Listen to him. More than to Moses and Elijah, more than to the law and the prophets, listen to him. And there he is, the Son of God, and the next thing he does is come down off the mountain to where the people are and heals a little boy who's having seizures. This man begs him, look at my son, he's my only child, and the spirit seizes him. And Jesus rebukes the spirit, and it leaves, and everyone, it says, is astonished at the majesty of God. They're amazed that Jesus has this kind of power. He has power over demons. He can cast out an evil spirit that's causing these seizures. But once again, notice how Jesus uses his power. They're wanting a Messiah who would defeat their enemies, who would command an army, who would kill the wicked, who would restore Israel to its glory. And instead, they get a Messiah who uses his power to free people from the demonic, to heal, to feed. It's a different kind of Messiah, isn't it? Jesus leads us from the mountain with God in this amazing experience down to the valley where the people are. That's part of the way of the cross, is yes, we need time with God. We need time in prayer. We need time in worship. But the call is for us to leave the mountain and go where the people are. To go where the needs are. To go where people need to know the Jesus who heals. And then while they're all marveling at everything he was doing, he says it again. The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men. Predicts it again. He's not going to be crowned king. He's going to be betrayed and handed over. But they did not understand this saying. They didn't understand it. Well, can't you understand it? It's as clear as a bell, isn't it? He said he's going there, they're going to kill him. And they don't understand. Can't wrap their head around it. It's so far outside their experience. Luke says it was concealed from them so they couldn't perceive it. I don't know if that means Jesus isn't ready for them to understand it. I think it just means they just can't understand it. It's so outside their experience, the meaning is just concealed. They can't perceive it. And they're afraid to ask him about it. That part intrigues me. They're afraid to ask, Afraid of what? Are they afraid of what it's going to mean for them if they follow him? Are they afraid that it's true and what this does to their whole vision? What are they afraid of? They won't ask, what does this mean? I wonder if sometimes we might be afraid of asking what it means for us to follow this kind of Messiah. You know, Christians today, not just today, throughout history too often, keep trying to capture political power, to force the world to do what we say is right. But it's important to note, Jesus did not seek political power, actually the opposite. He surrendered to the powers in his country. His call was to something different than political power. He used his power to heal people, to help people, to free people, not to control people or defeat people. And then Luke turns again to what does it mean to follow this kind of Messiah. And it's interesting. Right after Jesus says he's going to die, the apostles start arguing about who's the greatest. Seriously? I mean, Jesus just said, I'm going to Jerusalem. I'm going to be handed over. This is a path to a cross. And their next conversation is, I'm better than you are. I want the best position. I want the highest office. I want to be, if Jesus is president, I want to be vice president. Jesus knows what's going on, and he takes a child and sets the child beside them and says, whoever receives this child in my name receives me, for he who is least among you is great. Jesus takes the world and the world's values and just turns them upside down. We talked about that already when we looked at his sermon, his famous Sermon on the Mount. But he just turns the world upside down, and whatever is great in the world becomes least. Whatever's least in the world becomes great in the kingdom of God. And they want a Messiah who's going to establish power and glory and riches, and Jesus just flips that upside down and says, if you want to be great, that's not this path. To be great in the kingdom of God is to be least in this world. It's to serve. It's a path of self-sacrifice. And then the disciples start pointing fingers at people around them. They say, well, what about these people? Over here, there's this guy we saw casting out demons in your name, but he's not part of our group, so we told him to stop. He belongs to the wrong group. Jesus says, don't stop him, because if someone's not against you, he's for you. Oh, sometimes Christians need to hear that. We don't know who our enemies are, and too often Christians have thought our enemies are Christians that don't think right, like we think. They're not part of our group. And then they come to a village of the Samaritans, and we'll talk more about the Samaritans when we get to the Good Samaritan, but you could hardly, if you weren't one of these people living in the land at that time, you couldn't tell the difference in a Jew and a Samaritan. They practiced the same religion, the same Sabbath, the same feast, same sacrifices. It's just the Samaritans have a temple in Samaria with their priests, and the Jews have a temple in Jerusalem with their priests. And the disciples say, you want us to call down fire from heaven and wipe them out? And Jesus rebukes them for that attitude. Rebukes his followers for their sectarian spirit and judgmental attitudes, and we're the right ones and everybody else is the wrong ones. And in the battle with Satan, I think we need to know our enemies from our friends, and other Christians are not the enemy. In a world that needs to know Jesus, Methodists and Baptists and Catholics and people who believe in Jesus are our friends. But we spent too much time in a civil war. The cross calls us to unity and to grace toward others, not to sectarianism, judgmentalism. And then finally, one more time, Jesus reminds them of the cost of following the way of the cross. So sometimes it may cost a lot. It may require radical choices, even about choices within our families. The question is, are we willing to take up a cross and follow Jesus? He started the road to Jerusalem, and he's asking us to follow him on that road. Can we follow him on that road? I want to close by just sharing something with you from a Christian in Egypt. About 6 years ago, Palm Sunday, 2017, ISIS, that terrorist group, attacked Christians in Egypt. They're Coptic Christians, Egyptian Orthodox Christians. The Coptic Orthodox Church in Alexandria is the Middle East's largest Christian community. It's believed to be the oldest Christian community. They trace their history all the way back to Mark, early follower of Jesus. And on that day, on Palm Sunday, ISIS attacked and 47 Coptic Christians were killed in their churches on that Sunday, celebrating the start of Holy Week. And that night of Palm Sunday, the church was packed as people came to hear a popular preacher named Father George. He delivered, we called a message to those who kill us. I want to read some of what he said that day. Now, what will we say to those who kill us? I don't know. The first thing we will say is, thank you very, very, very much. And you won't believe us when we say thank you. You know why we say thank you? You won't get it, but please believe us. It's because you have given to us to die the same death as Christ. This is the biggest honor we could have. Christ was crucified, and this is our faith. He died and was slaughtered. This is our faith. And we thank you because you shortened for us the journey. When someone is headed home to a particular city, he keeps looking at the time. When will we get home? Are we there yet? Can you imagine if in an instant he finds himself on a rocket ship straight to his destination? You shortened the journey. Thank you for shortening the journey. You're helping us and you don't even know it. So he thanks them then. He says, because now you're packing our church. People that we couldn't even get to come to church are coming to church now to hear about Jesus and who we are and why this happened. The second part of the message I want to say after thanking you for these things, he says, the message we want to send to you is that we love you. And this, unfortunately, you won't understand at all. Why won't you understand it? Because this too is a teaching of our Christ. I long to talk to you about our Christ and tell you about how wonderful he is. See what Christ said? If you love those who love you, you have no profit or reward with me. Even thugs and thieves love those who love them. Gang members love its members, and the drug dealers all love each other and take care of each other. But I want to tell you, Jesus says, if you love those who love you, what reward have you? I say to you, love your enemies. The Christian, a Brother George says, doesn't make enemies because we're commanded by God to love all of his creation. And so we love you because this is the teaching of our God, that I'm to love you. No matter what you do to me, I love you very much. The last thing I want to say to you is we're praying for you, because that's what Jesus told us to do, to bless those who curse you and pray for those who spitefully use you. So what do you think he says to the church? What do you think? How about we make a commitment today to pray for them? To pray that they know the God of love. To pray that they experience the love of God. Because if they knew that God is love and experienced his love, they could not do these things. Never, never, never. That's a man, I think, who has some glimpse of what it means to take up a cross and follow Jesus. So what say you, church? Shall we pray for the world around us to know the love of God and experience the love of God? Let's take up a cross and follow Jesus. Let's stand and sing.